Well, the interesting thing is many times they're pieces I hadn't heard of until just before I introduced them to our musicians and our audience. It's not like I'm some kind of storehouse of unknown works, although my storehouse is building over time. But a lot of these pieces, maybe 6 to 9 months before the season, I was just learning about for the first time. And that occurs in a number of ways, and also that process has evolved over the last 30 years because mainly because of the internet. That's been a total game changer. When we first started out, the internet was very rudimentary, and I didn't know how to use it if it would have been helpful in that way. But I can remember, for example, anytime I saw a list of pieces of music, of chamber music, I would go through them and look for something that I thought was special. There are some books in libraries, and I have copies of several of them. Say, there's a book called The Piano in Chamber Music. I think that's the title of it. And it lists trios, quartets, quintets for piano and other instruments. And I would go through that book looking for, and it gives a little paragraph about the piece, giving you a little idea what it's like. And in the early days, I would scour books like that. There's also one for the bassoon and chamber music. There's one for flute. There's one for oboe. So I got to be very familiar with those. But one of my prizes, and it has a very Midsummer's Door County kind of quality to it, was in the early days, we played a children's concert at the Hardy Gallery in Ephraim, 11 o'clock in the morning. And after we played for the children, we would go outside, different members of the group, and get something to eat. And there was always a used book sale going on outside the Ephraim Village Hall where we played, where the Ephraim Library was selling books that they no longer wanted. And my wife, Jean, and our clarinetist, Mel Warner, and I would always go to this, and we'd look through the boxes of books. And I think they would give you a paper bag, and you could fill it up for $2. So you didn't have to be too careful about what you picked up. You weren't taking much of a chance. And at one of those book sales, either Jean or Mel spotted this book. It was from the 1920s. And it was by a guy named Proust, I think. And it was a kind of encyclopedia. It was a single volume, but it was basically an alphabetical listing of composers with a little biography and a smattering of listing of some of this composer's pieces. And because it was written in the 1920s, it had quite a smattering of composers who were fairly recent, maybe from the late 19th century into the 20th century, many of which had subsequently been forgotten. But I would sit at home in the winter up in Door County. I would be sitting there sometimes in the evening, just going page by page through some of these unknown composers. It had Beethoven and Brahms in it and so forth. But then you would come across Bohuslav Forster, a Czech composer that I'd never heard of. And then it suggested a few pieces that he'd written. And I discovered that he'd written a woodwind quintet that I knew nothing about. So I started making a list of some of these. So that was the old way of doing it. Now it's almost overwhelming how much information there is on the web sites that one can find. And a lot of times I'll just look up a composer, like the other day I just looked up Delius. I saw his name, Frederick Delius, wondering what he wrote from a chamber music standpoint, and discovered that he'd written a string quartet. So sometimes it's that kind of thing. I look up an opera composer to see, did they write any chamber music? So it's a convoluted process. And every once in a while, somebody comes up to me and asks me if I know of a piece that I haven't heard of, they suggested, and that's helpful too.